Welcome to End of Life University. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and this happens to be the very last episode of 2022. So I'm doing something a little different and a little bit special. This week, I'm going to be talking about the best news of 2022, the good news that's out there. And you may not know this if you're not a member of my Patreon page, but every month I create an end of life news update for my Patreon supporters where I go through the news, look through all kinds of articles and studies and essays that have been written, and curate a special list of the news for my patrons to read every month so they can kind of stay up to date with what's happening. That means then that I have a chance to stay up to date as well. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about some of the best stories that I have found in the news, the most positive stories around end of life care and various issues in our field. I think it's important that we take a moment to look at the good news of the past year, because sometimes we can get dragged down by all the negativity that's around us. And sometimes it might feel like things are falling apart and we might wonder where we're headed. But there actually are a lot of positive things happening that we may not recognize if we don't take a moment to look at them and talk about them. So that's what I want to do in this episode. And I've made some slides, which I love making slides, obviously. I'll show some slides because that helps me remember everything I wanted to cover and say. So if you're listening just to the audio on a podcast platform, you may want to hop over to YouTube and look for End of Life University channel there, where you'll be able to see the slides for this episode. But you don't have to. You'll be able to understand everything I'm saying. The slides are really just for me, first of all, so I don't have to just look at my own face for the entire time I'm talking. And also just to keep me organized so I don't forget anything or leave anything out, as we're talking about 2022 and some of the good things that happened. So I'm going to put the slides up now. And all right. As you can see, it is the good news of 2022, and genuinely, there has been some good news. So hang with me here in order to hear about it. So where I wanted to get started was back in February, the Lancet, which is it's an academic journal organization. They published a report from the Lancet Commission on the value of death, in which they made a call for a global paradigm shift on death and dying. I thought this was really impressive. And so the Lancet, it's read by people in medicine and academia all over the world. The fact that they came out with this special call for a paradigm shift, I thought was really a powerful start to 2022. And I wanted to just tell you a little bit more about what they recommended. So first, they stated 5 principles behind their report. Number 1 is to make death, dying, and grief more equitable. We know that's been a big issue in our own country, the fact that there are health disparities throughout our healthcare system, but significantly around the end of life as well, the access people have to end of life care, and some of the implicit bias and racism that's present in around end of life care, as well as other areas of healthcare. So we know that is an issue, and it is an issue globally as well. The second principle, recognize relational and the spiritual process of death. And so by relational, I take that to mean more the emotional aspect of death and dying. And they're really calling to rise above seeing death as a medical process that happens to the physical body only, and looking at the emotions and the spiritual changes that happened around death. To me, this is phenomenal, because this is a medical academic organization that's talking about spirituality and honoring emotions and relationships. I thought it was really powerful to see this. And let me explain one thing. This report is visionary. It's looking ahead, and it's a dream of how could it possibly be if we put all of our efforts forth, and what would we want to aspire to? So it's it's an aspirational list of principles. So it isn't exactly a practical framework for how we're going to get there. It's creating a vision for all of us to hold of where we would like to be headed and how we would like to move forward. So the third principle is to better involve families and community in care around end of life issues. And this, of course, is what hospice and palliative care and death doulas are all about. And so I love it that they included this as a core principle, a core value of how we must move forward if we're going to change how we view death and dying. And number 4 was to encourage public conversations around death and dying. So they're acknowledging that we simply don't talk about death, dying, and grief enough anywhere in the world. It doesn't happen often enough. We don't have conversations out in public about death and dying. And that's something we need to do more of. And then the 5th one I also loved, even though this is a little more vague, recognize that death has value. And I love this as an aspiration of what we want to put forward. And I could say this very podcast has that principle as well, to always emphasize that there is value in death. That's why we take so much care to discuss it with love and to hold all these stories of death and dying and grief with compassion and hold them in our hearts, but preserve them and share them. And recognizing the sacred in death and no longer shunning death, which has happened in the past in our society, in medicine as well, to embrace death and recognize the value that death has. So I love these 5 principles as the vision and the aspiration of where we want to head. And I think it's like creating intentions in some ways for our lives, or creating a vision statement for the future of what we would like to see happen in the future. It doesn't necessarily tell us how to do any of those things or how we will get there. We each have to figure out what we can contribute to help move forward on these 5 principles. So in this report, they also stated some areas of focus that they would like to see happen. So these are things we need to be working on sooner rather than later. And the first is education for lay people and professionals around all aspects of end-of-life care, conversations about death, advanced care planning, all of those things. We need education everywhere. And that has been one of my big kind of core issues over the last few years, encouraging people, everyone, to become educators in your own right. Educate your family, your friends, your neighbors on everything you know about end-of-life issues, everything that you've learned, and share resources with people. The next area of focus is increased access to pain relief. It's a big issue around the world in particular, but it is an issue right here in our own society. There are studies showing that African American patients in hospice receive less pain relief than white patients receive in hospice. So that's an issue for us to address here as well. Also, the opioid crisis has made it more challenging, more alarming for some physicians to prescribe pain medication, and it has shifted our access to pain relief somewhat for that reason. So this is something that's essential. We have to pay attention to pain relief in order to create dignity at the end of life. A third area of focus is empowerment of networks of care. Now, I'm putting my own spin and interpretation on that, that we create networks within our communities of care. And I'm not exactly sure that's how they meant it, but I believe in collaboration. That's been one of the other issues I've emphasized here through this podcast, is that we need to work together and we need to create networks wherever we live, bring together all of the people who are doing anything related to end of life, and strengthen our support for one another, and strengthen our communities, And that way we'll be able to find the gaps wherever we're missing the point, or we're not providing the care that we need. We can find them when we all work together, and we can creatively come up with solutions. So I love that idea as well. And then they also encourage government support for two issues in particular, government support for all of these areas, but two issues in particular that are huge right now: paying family caregivers and paid family and bereavement leave. So they've made a call for that worldwide, that we need to make sure family caregivers have a means of financial support so that they're not going into debt while caring for a loved one, and that they also get reimbursed something for the time that they give, and then paid family and bereavement leave so that workers are able to take time off to care for a loved one, or time off just for to attend a funeral, or time off for their own grief. So these are amazing, these 4 areas of focus. I'm on board with all 4 of these, and I love this, and I want to use this in a way as a framework. I guess in a way it already has been a framework for some of the episodes that I present here on the podcast, but I wanted all of you to know about it so you can keep these ideas in mind, and that these are the big issues. These are very big things, that if we can move the needle at all on any of these issues, we can make a difference in how we care for people at the end of life. And so the first issue was to make death, dying, and grief more equitable. And I just wanted to quote to you some of the articles that I've read in this area this past year. First of all, the NHPCO has created a diversity and inclusion toolkit that's available for free, that tells people how to make their place of business, but particularly hospices, more diverse and make sure they're inclusive. They've created a Black and African American outreach guide, a Chinese American resource guide for end-of-life care, and I believe they're creating other guides like this all the time and adding them to their website. So this is really big. They've made a commitment to making end-of-life care more equitable, and they're starting out by creating guides and resources for hospices and palliative care organizations to use in their own organizations to make sure they are providing healthy, diverse, and inclusive care. Then several studies have been done, one on implicit bias in dementia care for Black patients. Another study found less palliative care is available for Black and Hispanic patients in nursing homes. Another one found, I mentioned this already, less pain and symptom management for Black patients in hospice, and that rural patients have less access to hospice care. So these are all studies that have been ongoing and reported during this last year, and there are many more that are taking place right now. So this issue of inequality around death and dying has gotten attention, and people are looking into it and studying it. And I know sometimes we poo-poo a little bit, oh, a study to tell us something that we already knew because we could see it with our own eyes. Studies are important, though, because in order to get shifts in funding, in order to get more support, in order to change our educational systems, we have to be able to show evidence that these things are true, even though we can witness it with our own eyes. And studies right now are the way that we produce the evidence that is needed to help make the changes. So that's why it's good that these studies are being done. And then also there is a new model that's being tested for increasing equity in palliative care in underserved communities. They are training community health workers who live within the community to do outreach. So they're training them to learn all about hospice and palliative care and advanced directives so that they can go out to their neighbors and help educate their neighbors, answer their questions, make them feel safer, and help give them bring to them the care that they may need, and make sure that that's possible. And so I wanted to remind you of an interview I did earlier this year with Catherine Pettis. on global palliative care, current issues around the world. And she is part of the International Association for Palliative Care. She speaks at the UN regularly on changing UN policies and trying to bring pain management to underserved countries. It was an amazing interview, so I'll point you to that. I'm not exactly sure which month I did that, but it was earlier this year. So Catherine Pettis. And then also more recently, I've spoken with Elizabeth Johnson and Aaron Collins of the piece. Let's see. Now I can't remember. Sorry, I can't remember the name of their program, but they are in Oregon and they have created a community-based network, just as I was describing, bringing together all the important players that are present in their community, looking for the gaps that exist in their community and brainstorming and creating new projects that can help them fill those gaps. So another remarkable effort that is taking place that needs to be replicated, if possible, all around the country. So the second principle was to recognize relational or emotional and spiritual aspects of death. And a spirituality screening tool has been developed for heart failure patients, which helps practitioners identify how patients feel about spiritual issues as they're facing this serious health issue, and helping them to address spiritual issues to improve quality of life and decrease anxiety and depression. And that's what they have found. The tool has been very helpful to connect patients with the resources that they need. And again, this has been done with heart failure patients, but I imagine it's going to be replicated for other patients. And there was also a study on how spirituality affects end-of-life decision-making, which I found very interesting. And the fact that people's beliefs help determine the choices that they make, though many times those choices might be made on a lack of information, of correct information. So their beliefs will guide them in making choices, but they may be limited by how much they know or how much they have learned. So that was another very interesting study. And then here's a couple of headlines I took from online publications that there is a program to increase clinician-patient communication. And what they are helping clinicians to do is to shift their focus to what matters most to the patient, instead of focusing their conversations solely on treatment. They're actually talking to patients first about what matters to them. And so they're touching on some of those relational and spiritual issues of life in the midst of having this goals of care conversation. And they're also encouraging doctors to listen to the patients and validate the patient's emotions during these conversations. And so this is really powerful. This is education for clinicians on how to do a better job of communicating these very challenging issues to patients, and really focusing more on emotional and spiritual issues. And then also narrative medicine is being used, and I'll refer to a statistic to that from another article, but narrative medicine has been shown to develop empathy among physicians, and narrative medicine means listening to stories, encouraging patients to tell their stories and listening to their stories, and sometimes telling the patient a story. And so narrative medicine is really powerful, but they have found that it's very helpful in developing empathy. So we'll talk about that again, as I said, in another article. In terms of talking about the spiritual process of death, my interview with Rhonda Lopresti was very interesting. She has created a spiritual care directive. First of all, she created one for Buddhists at the end of life, but then she adapted that for anyone. So it is a more generic spiritual care directive. And it is a phenomenal resource. If you didn't hear that episode, I encourage you to go back and take a listen, because Rhonda's done a really beautiful job of creating that directive, and she's made it available for free. Anyone can download it and utilize it. And then more recently, I had a conversation with Aditi Sethi about her Center for Conscious Living and Dying, where she also, on the one hand, they're creating a home where patients can reside as they're receiving end-of-life care if they don't have a suitable place to live when they're receiving hospice or palliative care. But there's a strong focus on consciousness and spirituality and helping people live their lives to the fullest, including emotional and spiritual issues, as they are approaching death, and then also talking about the emotional and spiritual aspects of death. So again, that was another really beautiful interview. And then also Barbara Carnes and I talked about creating a sacred space at the moment of death. And this is a very practical issue because Barbara shares all kinds of tips for how to be present at the time of a patient's death and to make that moment as sacred as possible. Just simple little things that you could do, whether you're a medical provider, a hospice volunteer, a family member, a friend. If you're present when someone is dying, these are tips of things that you could do to help create and hold a sacred space. And that was a really wonderful conversation as well. So the third principle, involving families and community in care. And I wrote some things, I picked up on some articles that I loved seeing, that these are articles from the community of people that you might not have expected to be caring about end of life issues, but there's an estate lawyer who has written a book to help his clients with end of life planning. Oh, I have a typo in there on planning, sorry. And there are financial planners who are helping clients prepare for the possibility of becoming caregivers in the future and also for aging in place. So these planners are helping clients at a younger time in life to create assets and to set aside money. They're talking to them about, if you have to be a caregiver for a loved one, this is what you're going to need. If you need to be in assisted living or long-term care, this is what you will need. So they're helping clients prepare very practically, financially, for what may come down the road. And it really touched me that they're actually studying end of life issues and learning about it so that they can help their clients better. So these are articles that I read in financial magazines and journals online for financial planners to help them be better equipped to work with their clients. And then also financial planners are learning about grief in order to better serve their clients who have experienced loss, because they've recognized that many of the people who come to them for help are actually dealing with loss. They come after the death of a loved one when they're having to sort out their finances. So financial planners are seeking information and education so they understand grief and know how they can work with and talk with their own clients. And I think that's beautiful. I love it. I love how things are starting to come together. People in many areas are waking up and recognizing death and grief and having so much less fear at talking about it and being able to come right out and say, oh, let's have a conversation about this right now. And they're taking the time to educate themselves where needed so that they have the proper information in order to have those conversations. The fourth principle was to encourage public conversations, and they also called for government support in many of these areas. So I just screenshot some of the headlines that have come up. In New York, lawmakers are calling for a campaign promoting advanced care. So they want to have kind of a grassroots community-based campaign to teach people all about hospice and palliative care and about preparing ahead and filling out advance directives. There is federal legislation in the works that would create a national strategy on grief. I think that's amazing as well. I think that would be really nice for us to see that there is attention being paid to grief, particularly after going through the COVID pandemic the last few years. And then Congress, right now, there's a bill working its way through Congress to expand advanced care planning. So it's nice to see our government acknowledging issues around death, dying, and grief, and willing to take up the mantle in a way and work on committing funding to help in these areas. And then fifth, recognize that death has value. Again, this is a little more intangible in a sense, but I just recently did an interview that I absolutely loved with Barbara Becker on her book called Heartwood. And we talked about the cycle of life and loss, and it's all about the value of death. And so this touches my heart. This is what I want to share as much as any other message for everyone. So this episode was very precious to me. If you didn't hear it, please go back and listen to it. Please encourage people you know to take a listen. And this is how we can share the value of death, by telling stories like this, by encouraging people to read books and write their own stories into books and share them with one another. And so one of the focuses of the report was on family caregivers. And first of all, that we need to pay them. And here's some things that have been in the news this year. There have been studies done on the importance of caregiver education, and that it makes a difference in how often the patient returns to the emergency room for care when caregivers are educated and engaged in the care of their loved one, and they know what they're doing. They are able to keep the patient at home far more and less likely to return to the emergency room. There's also a report on caregiver burnout and stress, which we're all aware of, and we see it all around us. But it's good to put this in numbers and to have a study that actually shows that this is a real thing, in order to get more attention and to hopefully someday get funding here. There have been some demonstration models on paying family caregivers, and I haven't yet seen the outcome from those. I just know that they have been started, and there are, in small ways, they're working to see what a difference it makes when family caregivers are paid to offer care. But I also learned that Medicaid has a process for paying family caregivers who qualify. The patient has to be receiving Medicaid, so has to qualify financially for Medicaid, has to have a particular need for care that the family caregiver has the training to provide in order for the caregiver to be paid for that. So it requires a little bit of work, because the caregiver might have to show that they've received some sort of education about a process, doing wound care or giving insulin shots or something like that. If the caregiver can show that they've had training and that this is a significant need for the family member and the caregiver has been trained to meet the need, then they may qualify for Medicaid reimbursement, which is amazing. And I didn't even know that already exists, and that's already possible. So we need more people to know about it and be aware of it in order to look into it. And then also there's another program that is training caregiving navigators to help family caregivers. And the navigators are learning about all sorts of things. They learn about all the resources available in the community. They learn the ups and downs of how to get someone into hospice, how to get into a long-term care facility, and they make themselves available to caregivers in the community and help guide them through the system, because sometimes the system itself is so complex and it's so hard to figure out. It's tangled, and there's sort of a nightmare of bureaucracy. So the navigators are being trained in all of these areas so that they can sit down with a caregiver and walk them through whatever it is they need to know in order to provide the best care. And as far as episodes on the podcast, early in the year, I did an interview with Dr. Jessica Zitter, and we talked about the caregiver crisis here in the US and meeting the needs of the future. Another great episode. Jessica Zitter is a great advocate for caregivers, and you can hear her story of how she became aware of the needs of caregivers and why she is so passionate about that now. And then there was an interesting report, another report on the best and worst places to die in the United States. And I thought this was rather interesting. They based this judgment that they did, this little contest, the best and worst contest, on these factors: the accessibility and availability of funeral services, particularly affordable funeral services. So they looked at what's available to people, how much does it cost in the areas where you live, availability of green burial as an option, availability of palliative care, availability of Medicare providers, the availability of at-home deaths, like with hospice or a death doula, and then financially, the availability of probate shortcuts. And that's not something I know very much about, but those were the factors, some of the factors that they looked at in order to determine the best and worst places to die in the United States. And I know you're curious, as I was, to see this is based on, but by state by state. I'm sure, no, you're curious like I was to see what these states are, and am I living in one that's good or bad? So the best states to die in the US, and these are in order 1 through 10: Vermont, Utah, Idaho, Ohio, South Dakota, Maine. Colorado is tied with Illinois, and New Hampshire, and Washington. So those are the 10 best places to die. And I live in Colorado half the year, so that's good news for me. Then the 10 worst places to die. And I think I'm not sure. These are also labeled 1 through 10, but I don't know if that means least worst to most worst or most worst to least worst. But anyway, the worst places to die in the United States are Florida, Alaska, Texas, Hawaii, New York, Georgia, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina, Connecticut. So if you happen to live in one of those 10 states, there's work to be done. Some things need to be improved and changed within the states to make things better. And of course, this was looking at the state as a whole. It doesn't mean that there aren't many wonderful communities within any of these states that provide amazing care at the end of life. So that was a shortcoming of this report, but I thought it was interesting. And sometimes it's good for us to be called out a little bit and to shine the light a little bit on what is not working so well. And next, some changes in medicine. And this I'm really excited about. A study showing that psychedelic assisted therapy helps to ease end-of-life anxiety. And another study showing that comparing the benefits of psychedelic medication with near-death experiences, and found that both of them reduce the fear of death, have a positive effect on personal meaning of life and death, on spiritual awareness and psychological insight. So this was really powerful toward that goal of from the commission on recognizing the spiritual aspect of death and dying, spiritual and emotional. So we know that people who've had near-death experiences often have these positive benefits afterwards. But this study showed the psychedelic medications in assisted therapy have some of the same benefits. But a third study shows virtual reality is similar to psilocybin therapy for reducing anxiety at the end of life. So here we have near-death experiences create this effect, but not everyone can have a near-death experience. You can't just choose to have one. They happen whenever they happen. So psychedelic assisted therapy can create similar benefits to a near-death experience, and virtual reality, which takes place without any side effects or without consuming any type of medication, is very similar as well for reducing anxiety at end of life. So that's really exciting that we have these options available, which can really make a difference in those emotional issues and spiritual issues around end of life, the anxiety and fear that are present. And then in other news, more and more states are decriminalizing magic mushrooms, which is the source of psilocybin. Oregon and Colorado, they're now legal. Colorado just this year, the residents of the state voted for that. And there are 10 other states considering decriminalizing mushrooms, or AKA psilocybin, for medical use, particularly at the end of life. So that's exciting that there's a lot more openness, and apparently that's happening in other places in the world as well. And here are some of the headlines. One, the comparison of psychedelic and near death or other non-ordinary experiences in changing attitudes about death and dying. And another headline, virtual reality is as good as psychedelics at helping people reach transcendence. And within the article, they specifically mentioned rising above the anxiety of death and end of life. Then some progress in medical education. The University of Arizona is offering end-of-life training to all medical students, which is amazing. We need that at every single medical school, but it has to start somewhere. So at least it has. It started in one program. I'm sure there are other programs offering it, but this happens to be the article that I read this year about this new offering at the University of Arizona. There are 5 medical schools who are adding palliative care to their curriculum for medical students, which is really good. Pennsylvania, New Mexico, Nebraska, Arizona, and Maryland, those state medical schools. And this is like a domino effect. Once these changes happen in a few schools, it tends to spread out in ripples to other schools, because schools are competitive somewhat and they don't want to be left behind and not offering the latest and best teaching to their students. So it's great that this is beginning, and I anticipate that it will keep growing and spreading. And for example, 80% of medical schools now have integrated narrative medicine into their curriculum. Narrative medicine, again, being storytelling, listening to patient stories, encouraging patients to tell stories, telling them stories as well if there's a healing story that could be told that could be helpful to a patient. And so again, in studies, narrative medicine increases empathy among physicians. It's been very powerful. And so 80% of medical schools are now utilizing it. That's pretty amazing. That's a huge shift that has just happened recently. So see, we're on our way. We're on our way. Things will be better down the road. And then also a study on the importance of validating patient emotions, plus talking about the likely outcome of continuing treatment. So what they are teaching these clinicians to do is first listen to the patient, let the patient tell stories, find out what emotions they're feeling, and listen and validate those emotions. Instead of encouraging them to try to change how they feel about things, just listen and validate what they're feeling. And then talking very honestly about the likely outcome of continuing treatments. And when clinicians were honest and straightforward about here are the options, this is what might happen, this is the likelihood of this happening if we go this direction, and really spelling it out honestly for patients, they found that 73% of the patients who had that type of conversation with their clinician chose palliative care instead of continuing aggressive treatment, whereas only 43% chose palliative care without having that conversation. So they made a significant difference simply by listening and being honest with patients. which is something we've been asking for such a long time. So again, here we have a study, but this study is something that we can take to our educational presentations with clinicians in our own community to talk about how and why you need to have better conversations with people about the end of life, about treatment, about options available to them. And then another study showing that mindfulness increases compassion and reduces burnout for medical providers. That's another like, well, of course it does. Like, who would even doubt that? But once again, we have to have studies because people who are reluctant to move in this direction need evidence and need numbers in order to help them see, oh, wow, it really did make a big difference. So this is important. All of these studies are important as we move forward. Next, there have been some big inroads in an area called death tech, and I'm only reporting a few of them here. There's just been an explosion of technology around end of life issues. And so this whole area, it's been labeled officially death tech. One that I'm interested in, hospices are using artificial intelligence to predict eligibility for hospice care. There was one article on that, and then a second article about machine learning models to help predict a 6-month cancer mortality. And the artificial intelligence is far better than clinicians in predicting prognosis for patients. One of the reasons being that they feed in data to these machines. So for machine learning, it can learn millions and millions of cases they feed in. This is the patient's diagnosis. These are the symptoms. This is how things progressed. They feed this data in for so many patients. The artificial intelligence has the ability to learn from all of that data. Now, that's also what clinicians do. Clinicians learn from every patient they've ever seen. They learn from studies that they read from their colleagues, stories they've heard. But clinicians come nowhere near hearing about 10 million patients and the outcomes for that many patients. So clinicians base their estimates on prognosis for patients on their own experience, the data they themselves have taken in. That's what the artificial intelligence does also. It's just that the AI can take in so much more data than one human being can. So the machines have been far more accurate and effective at predicting when patients have 6 months or less to live. So I think we're going to be moving more and more in this area of relying on these models to help, because it may help get some patients into end of life care more quickly than they would have in the past. And it may help us also prevent fraudulent admissions of patients who shouldn't be there. And I think that would be a big benefit. And we'll talk a little more about that later on. Then, there's an app for caregivers, which right on their phone, it teaches them skills. They can look up if they need to know how to do something. They can look up a little video or a tutorial on skills they need to have. It provides tips and tools for them for the care they're trying to give, and also reminders for self-care. So that's an amazing app that's out there. There are a number of different bereavement apps. One is called Empathy, and Grief Refuge is another one. They help people who are grieving by giving them reminders and also sharing information and helping them get access to support for their grief. There's an app called Better Leave, which is available for employers to give to their employees who are grieving. And it helps employees with funeral planning, settling estate issues, and finding grief resources. So it's a benefit that employers can offer to their employees who are grieving. So this is just the beginning. These are only a few. I'm only touching the surface here. Another app called Bereave, which helps people prepare for death and create end-of-life plans. It is culturally inclusive, and so it includes all religions and cultures cultures. So it's it's something that practically anyone could get a benefit from. So I thought that was very interesting as well. I did an interview, the very first interview of 2022, with Jeremy Powell, who talked about this machine learning model and some other technology advances for end of life care. So if you're interested in that, go back and take a listen to that interview. And then I wanted to cover a little bit about death in the media. Like, this has been going on for several years now, but there's really been an explosion of articles in the media around death, dying, and grief. We've seen regular articles in Forbes, and the New York Times has a whole section in their health department on death and dying, and have regular articles being posted there that are amazing. The Washington Post also has covered a lot. And on the negative side, as we are all aware, the New Yorker and ProPublica together produced an article referring to hospice as a for-profit hustle. And I'm sure we've all been pretty devastated by that article coming out in the media. How, while describing things that exist, that have happened, that are true, perhaps overemphasizing the negative with not nearly enough attention paid to the positive. But I view it that article was written by someone who, for some reason, had a need to deconstruct whatever was seen as being wrong with hospice without any need to support and build up what is right about hospice. I'm not going to go into it because Dr. Ira Byock and I are planning to have a conversation, which we're going to share here on the podcast as soon as he's available to do that. And we'll go into that whole article in detail. But I did want to say, someone said there's no such thing as bad publicity. And while this article hurt all of us very much because of what it left out, what it didn't say, and our fear that perhaps some people might have been scared away from hospice or misled and misinformed by what's in the article, I think it's really important that we take responsibility and be able to say, you know what, we have some problems within our field in hospice right now. There are some bad actors, there are some bad things going on, and we would like to make those better. The only way we make anything better is by recognizing it first and owning up to it. And so if we're in a position of trying to deny that bad things sometimes happen in hospices, we lose credibility with all the people out there who may have had a bad experience in hospice. But if we're willing to say, this article pointed out some things that are very disturbing that we would like to make better, and we're going to devote ourselves to working on fixing some of the problems that exist within our system. And I think that's the attitude we have to say. We can't deny that it's true because we've all seen some of these things happen around us, and we know that there is truth to it, though a much smaller truth if you have it all in the proper perspective. The good that hospice does so far outweighs the negative things that have happened, yet let's not deny it. Let's own up to it, and let's say how we're going to work on making things better. That's just one little take on that. So yes, it was painful publicity, but there were a lot more people talking about hospice that week than there may have been the week before. So again, another something more positive, death and the media. There is on Catholic TV, a show on palliative care, and it's very popular. It got renewed for a second season. It's won awards, and I think it's awesome. I think it's great. Like these two, I think there's these two women, I can't remember now. I think it's a doctor and perhaps a nurse. They come together and they talk about palliative care. They've covered every little issue of what palliative care is, what it does. They've talked about advanced care planning. They tell stories. They just come together and educate people. And apparently they're a lot of fun to listen to. So, hey, let's get more of that out there in the world too. We need more of this kind of positive programming around hospice and palliative care. And it's fun to see that their season got renewed and they've won awards for what they're offering. So there's an audience for this kind of information. And speaking of being in the audience, two things on uh, streaming channels that I've been obsessed with this year. One is Dead to Me. It started a few years ago, but I binged watched. There are 3 seasons now. The third was the final season, which I just recently finished. Powerful. It's dark. It's dark dramedy, I guess. There's some drama, some comedy in Dead to Me, and you have to have a taste for really dark humor sometimes. But it deals a lot with grief and death and the challenges of living with our grief and of trying to turn our grief into something productive and trying to grow through grief. And I really enjoyed it, and I was happy to see. I'm happy to see these programs that are dealing with death and grief. And so Dead to Me appealed to me. It's not for everyone, for sure, because the humor is dark and could be offensive to some people, but I really enjoyed it. And I recently watched the Netflix series From Scratch, which is absolutely beautiful. I so encourage everyone to watch it. It's one season of, I think, 8 episodes, and so beautiful and such a moving portrayal of an end of life story. I felt that it was very honest in terms of the encounter they had with the medical system and their challenges trying to get answers to questions, trying to get connected to palliative care or hospice, but so beautifully done. Absolutely amazing. And in an upcoming interview I have with Tracy Wheeler from Endwell, we have a whole discussion about this series that takes place. So anyway, I encourage you to watch From Scratch. I think anyone would enjoy. It's sad. It's a tearjerker. You will cry. Dead to Me, only if you like kind of quirky, dark humor. Watch that. I know there are other shows out there that are dealing with death, dying, and grief. There's just been an amazing explosion in the media, and I'm really happy to see it because of this idea that we need public conversations, and a series on television is one way of having a public conversation about death and dying. It's not a facilitated conversation, so there's nobody there to help answer questions for people or to encourage them to talk about how they feel, but it's one way of opening people's minds and hearts a little bit to talking about end of life issues. So I'm excited to see that. Also, as I'm recording this, it's holiday season and we're inundated with holiday movies, in which I think every single movie I've seen so far, there's a character within the movie who hates Christmas, but it turns out is grieving the death of someone they love. And that's why they hate Christmas. And so, wow, grief and the holidays, that's a huge theme right now for Hallmark and everyone else who makes holiday movies. So it's out there and it's visible. Death and dying and grief, more and more visible to people. So watch these series so you can talk to your neighbors and friends about it and answer some of their questions, and maybe you have information that will help them understand a little bit better these characters and these shows and why these things happen. And so also on the media, there is a new hashtag. It's not new actually, but the hashtag EOL is a hashtag that's being used on TikTok right now. And this is the headline of an article saying death is no laughing matter, but on Death Talk, it is. So TikTok is a social media platform where people make short little videos. But there is a subset of TikTok called Death Talk, where people talk about death. And apparently, they're doing it with a lot of humor on Death Talk, and using this hashtag EOL for end of life. Also, I've heard that there are some people on TikTok, some young people who themselves have a terminal diagnosis, and they are sharing their stories on TikTok using the hashtag EOL and telling everyone what is it like to be told that you only have a short time to live, sharing what they're experiencing and what they're going through. And this is really phenomenal to me as well. So these are mostly TikTok appeals mostly to younger people, though plenty of people my age are going on it and watching the videos there. But it's very interesting. But when death has such a presence on social media that it has its own category, Death Talk, I think that's really powerful. I think it means that we're losing some of our fear of talking about death and dying and grief. And then another bit of good news from this year, human composting is now legal in 5 states: Washington, Colorado, Oregon, Vermont, and California. And New York is considering it, so that it could happen in the near future in New York as well. So that's a real move forward for the human composting movement, and glad to see that option becoming more and more available for people. And if you're interested to learn more, I did an interview at the beginning of the year with Micah Truman and Bree Smith on Terramation, which is another name for human composting. And they talked all about their company that offers human composting and how it works. And it was very informative and very interesting. So that's another interview you could go back and listen to. And then finally, just to wrap it up, I have the very best news of 2022, at least in my opinion, for me personally. In 2022, I became a grandmother for the first time. And this is little baby Ella, who was born in July. And so life changed a lot for me. Now, as a grandmother, I have a very important new job helping my son and his wife take care of little baby Ella. And um, this, I know lots of you are grandparents, and so I'm not saying anything new that you don't already know about, but it's really a profound change in life to be not the primary the primary parent for a child who's growing up and have all of the responsibilities and all of the work and exhaustion of that, but to be one step away as a grandparent and to be able to offer help wherever I can, to be there, and to just once again see the world through the eyes of a brand new human being. It's incredible. And the other day I held up an apple for her, and her eyes were huge, and she looked at it with the most amazing amazement, as if, oh my goodness, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And she reached her hand out and touched the apple, and I thought, that is how we are meant to see everything in this life. We're meant to keep those innocent eyes of amazement and to always see life and every aspect of life for the wonder that it is, to always recognize the beauty and the newness in everything and take that in. And so being a grandmother is just helping me recommit to seeing life every day as precious and as a miracle to experience. And it doesn't matter what negative things are happening. There are always apples there to look at. There are always miracles around us. There's always beauty to find and to see wherever we go. So that is my message here at the end of 2022, to stay the course, to remember to see the world through your own innocent eyes, and look for the miracles, look for what's amazing. See the preciousness of every moment that you have, and live it as fully as possible, since we never know how many of those moments are going to be there for us. So I send you all my love and all my best wishes as we move into the new year. Thank you all for your faithful listening. Thank you for your support that you offer on Patreon and PayPal and through Buy Me a Coffee. I appreciate it so very much. And looking forward to another beautiful year in 2023. And I'm sending so much love to each one of you and all of your beloveds in your life. So until we're together the next time, remember that we're really here for love. So face your fear, be ready for whatever life brings you next, and love each and every moment of your precious life. Bye.